Hey everyone, and welcome to the Grow Hemp series. Today, we'll be showing you how to start an indoor grow with the most basic grow tent setup possible for around $200 and give a step-by-step guide on how my first indoor grow went with this setup. So let's go over all the equipment needed first before I explain how to put it all together. I started with a 2x2x4 grow tent, which after receiving it actually turned out to be a 1.5x1.5x4 grow tent. Not what I ordered, but it would have been too much of a hassle to send it back, and it still did the job, so I stuck with it. This is probably the smallest grow tent I would recommend for an indoor grow, and it will fit one plant comfortably and probably two plants max, although they'll be fighting for space in the tent. I then needed a power strip to connect everything to, and then I found a cheap mechanical timer at the local thrift store to turn on and off the grow lights automatically. For lighting, I went with a LED light. I chose a LED light with a built-in heatsink and fans because it was the easiest to work with and the price point was on par with the other lighting options. But with the LED lighting, I didn't have to worry about any heating issues and didn't have to buy any equipment to manage the heat. I was also able to get a cheap USB fan at the same thrift store, which I was able to MacGyver into an exhaust fan. For the grow tent, all the intake and exhaust holes can be adjusted in size. So as long as the fan isn't ridiculously big, you can make it work as a makeshift intake and exhaust fan. I initially didn't put in an intake fan because I wanted to see if a basic USB fan as the exhaust was enough to create the airflow needed for the plant to survive, and it worked, which was really surprising. I never had to switch the exhaust fan out for the entire grow, and I didn't really put in an intake fan until near the end of my grow, which doubled as a fan for the plant. So overall my costs were $131 to build the most basic functional grow tent possible. Note that if you have to order everything online, the mechanical timer and the USB fans are going to cost a little bit more than what I found at the thrift store. Now to fill the tent, I got a feminized seed for $10, grow supplies which included a clay pot, potting soil, perlite, and fertilizer for about $20, and finally the utility cost for my first 3-month grow was about $30 for electricity and $10 for the water. For the seeds and for the grow supplies, I bought in bulk because I was planting multiple plants. So the cost was broken down over about 5 plants. If I bought the seeds and the grow supplies for just one plant, it would have been a little bit more expensive. Note that this is as basic as it gets and doesn't include a couple of options that some people will need. This setup doesn't include an air carbon filter, which would completely eliminate the smell. However, this would require ducking, a carbon filter, and a real exhaust fan instead of a small USB fan, which adds about $100 to $200 to the setup. I will cover the carbon filter in my next grow tent video, where I'll be building a more advanced grow tent setup. And let's put it all together. A grow tent is extremely easy to build. You just snap the metal bars together and then put the fabric over the bars. This tent took me about 10-15 minutes to put together. Now I installed the power strip on the grow tent. There are a lot of ways to do this with tape or other adhesives, and you don't need to directly install it on the tent as long as the strip is close enough for all your equipment. But if you plan on moving the tent around, I definitely recommend installing the power strip on the grow tent. For this setup, I just used a screw through the tent and secured the other side with a wall anchor. I then hung the power strip on it and then installed the LED lights by including the clips that came with the light, and then just clipped the light directly onto one of the top bars of the grow tent. Now, because of the height of the grow tent, I didn't feel like it was necessary to install a way to adjust the height of the light. I then plugged it into the mechanical timer and adjusted the timer for 18 hours of light per day. Finally, I installed the USB exhaust fan by removing its legs and then zip tying it in place on the top bars of the grow tent. I had all the wires go through the back hole and then I closed it up to prevent light from coming in. And that's it. It's pretty simple to do. It took me about half an hour. And the final thing I did, because my grow tent was located directly under a window, I just put a fabric pot on top of the grow tent, which worked perfectly because it blocked the light out and the handles lifted the pot to let the exhaust air through. And now it's time to test the setup. This was my first attempt at indoor growing, so this video will be filled with a ton of mistakes and regrets. But in the end, through all the errors, I was still able to make it work, which shows just how resilient hemp is. And how if even a beginner like me can do this, anybody can. I started my grow with a Jiffy pot. These are small pellets that when placed in warm water will create an ideal grow environment for seeds. Now came the first of many mistakes in starting out. I used a small light with the Jiffy pot and left it in an otherwise dark area for the seed to germinate. The problem is that I left it like this for 3 days after the seed germinated because I thought it was still growing. But what happened was it just grew super tall and stringy because of the lack of light, which you'll see caused a huge problem once I transplanted it into a pot. For the clay pot, I went with 2/3 potting soil and 1/3 perlite and placed the plant inside. I made another mistake here because the bag of soil I used was open and sitting outside for about a week, which apparently led to gnats laying their eggs in the soil and caused a lot of gnats to appear in my grow area. As you can see, I tried to get rid of them with a cup filled with juice as a trap, and when that didn't work, I used a topical spray, which is supposed to kill the eggs, and I also used a sticky trap for the adults. But at this point, it doesn't even matter because the plant fell over. This is when I realized that even though the plant was getting taller, it wasn't actually really growing. It was just stretching because of the light. And I tried to first prop it up with a stick, but that wasn't working. So after doing a little bit of research, people recommended adding more soil to support the plant, which actually worked. Now, after all of the mistakes starting out, we're finally on cruise control. Since I wanted the plant to be in her vegetative stage, the light schedule was set to 18 hours of light a day. I would check on the plant every other day or so and water the plant anytime the soil felt dry, an inch below the surface, which was once every few days early on, but by the end of the grow would be basically every day. For every other feeding, I would include grow nutrients, and although the gnats persisted in the grow tent for a while, they were completely gone after about a month. I had a small USB fan that I used to circulate air throughout the tent, but it was really weak. So once the plant was large enough to handle some wind resistance, I used a more conventional USB fan that I had lying around. This is important for 2 reasons. One is that having moving air in the grow area will prevent a number of diseases and pests from attacking the plant. And 2, because the wind forces the main stem to grow stronger to resist it, which makes for a stronger plant in general. Also note that since this was my first indoor grow, I didn't want to try and utilize any grow techniques to maximize size or yield. Topping, low stress training, super cropping, none of that would be done. And let's face it, considering how much I had already messed up, just having the plant be harvestable would be accomplishment enough. Now, as we wait for the plant to grow, I have some time to explain a couple of things about the choices I made for this grow. First of all, I used a standard potting soil with no synthetic fertilizers included. While handy for vegetation, the soils with built-in synthetic fertilizers usually contain too much nitrogen for when the plant is flowering and could cause a nitrogen toxicity. If you want or have to use a soil that has built-in synthetic fertilizers, because they're the most common soils available everywhere, I mean, anything that says 3 months, 4 months, or 6 months of feed included on the package is a part of this category. Be sure to watch out for nitrogen toxicity when flowering, and if it happens, you can flush the pot with water to try and wash away the excess fertilizer. I also added 1/3 of perlite to the soil, which is like a lightweight rock. because it helps the soil from storing too much water, which is harmful for the roots. This is especially important for new growers because we tend to overwater, which can lead to a lot of issues with the plant or even kill the plant. I definitely recommend new growers to add at least a fourth of perlite with their soil. Finally, I went with the clay pot because, well, our logo is literally a plant planted in a clay pot. I will say that after trying out fabric pots in my later grows, that I would recommend using fabric over clay, unless you're growing outdoors and have problems with it being too cold or too hot, because the clay pots will insulate the soil temperature better. At this point, I realized that the height of the fan was also the same height as the intake hole in the grow tent. So I just put it in the intake hole and it was able to do double duty as both the intake fan as well as the circulating air fan. I should have thought about this earlier, but better late than never. As you can see now, there are some leaves on the bottom that are starting to yellow and show brown spots. This appears to be a calcium and magnesium deficiency. I didn't originally include calcium or magnesium in my feed because I was using tap water, which already contains a little of both. However, it appeared that the plant wasn't getting enough of either, so I started including it into my feed, which solved the issue. Now the plant is getting to be about a foot tall, and because hemp can grow almost double in height at the beginning of the flowering stage, I figured it was time to switch to flower by changing the light cycle from 18 hours to 12 hours a day. Unfortunately, my camera froze for about a week into flowering, so I'm missing a week of video showing the plant stretching during the beginning of the flowering stage. However, I do have one final still to show how much the plant stretched when she first started to flower, which was about 50% of her original height before flowering. So now that I've moved the camera higher, the plant has stopped stretching and is now completely focused on flowering. I trimmed off some of the larger fan leaves on top so that the lower flowers and buds could get more light to develop. And I've also switched my feed from a grow fertilizer to a bloom fertilizer. Now as you can see here, I've included a close-up video of the main stalk to show what happens during flowering. The flowering phase starts with the stretching of the plant before the flower starts to bloom. From there, the buds will start to form around the flowers and get bigger and bigger, while the trichomes are forming on the buds and nearby fan leaves. They start out clear, and as they mature, they'll become foggy and finally start to turn into an amber color. When this starts to happen, it's time to harvest. As you can see here, the trichomes are now fully formed, but they're still clear, so there's still some time till harvest. Now we can see that almost all the trichomes are completely cloudy and some are starting to turn amber, so it's time to harvest. So I brought the plant out to harvest and I cut off most of the main stem and side branches. I left about a third of the plant intact because I wanted to try and regenerate the plant. You'll learn more about what that means in a future grow episode. Here, I'm having problems getting the plant out of the pot, so I just decided to break it open. Taking a look inside, you can see that while the plant was definitely root bound, she was healthy as seen from the white roots. Now that I've replanted her, it's time to trim. There isn't much to say about trimming because how much or how little you decide to trim, it's all up to personal preference. For me, I removed the major fan leaves without any trichomes on them, and then everything else I cut, I saved in a paper bag. I trimmed the buds lightly so nothing was sticking out of them, and then I stopped there. Now for drying, since I had a lot of small buds and one large main stem, I bought a cheap mesh laundry basket to dry all the buds in, and then I clipped the larger stem onto a hanger. I left everything to dry for about 5 days, at which point the buds felt dry to the touch, so it was time to bottle it up. After weighing it, the total amount harvested was about 2/3 of an ounce. Not bad considering the fact that I had to flower her early because of the small tent size and because I didn't use any grow techniques at all, which are crucial for small grow setups like this, but I'm just glad the plant actually made it considering all the mistakes I made.